Jesus, a really long, I have to watch my language, because there are going to be all kinds of folks watching. Let me start all over. We're culminating a very long and aggressive period of care. And I'm putting emphasis on care because we all know about the other stuff. But isn't it extraordinary the kinds of ways we worked around caring for each other? I'm so excited to introduce to you tonight's keynote speaker, who actually literally was the animating thinker person,
just brain behind the whole season. It was actually a conversation with this person, and that led us to this theme. So HR's initiative, founded in 1993 in response to racialized tensions between communities of color. We believe in the power of art to create community. I'm just really delighted to be introducing a writer, because writers are also artists, and writers are also cultural laborers. yeah. But also writers get to tell the story of the other artists, right? And so I'm just really excited today by Angela Garbes, who will be talking about your next book. And I won't try to foreshadow what that's all about. But as the bard of a culture, both from a context of
Filipino-American background and, in the care ecosystem and in the arts and culture ecosystem, so excited. I just want to make sure I get all of the admins. Okay. I've done a bunch of acknowledgements upstairs. I've done a bunch of acknowledgements upstairs. You can find us on social media. YouTube, if you're already on there. LinkedIn. That's the most important one, LinkedIn. All right. I think that's it. I'm not forgetting anything.
Angela Garbes.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you so much for inviting me to be here. When Anne, I think we started talking this summer about it, and when she put it out there, I was like, yes, whatever you want me to do, I'll do anything Anne says. So this is the first in real life that I've done in almost 2 years, so it feels really significant. It feels very significant to do it at an Asian community organization. That's very meaningful to me. And I was born here in Pennsylvania. I've not spent a lot of time here, so it's fun to be back. And yeah, so I'm very excited to speak about care. I have a book coming out that is entirely about care. So I've been working on this book for the last year and a half, and it's basic. The book is coming out in May, and it's called Essential Labor: Mothering as Social Change. And it's very much a history of care work in America, and also kind of a call to double down on the radical potential of mothering and caregiving. We are children's first teachers, and there's really, in every day, even in the drudgery, there's a million ways to begin to shape a more equitable world and to begin to impart values that are more in line with how we want to live. So I'm going to read from a couple of chapters about that. So all of this is framed, to write the history of care work in America is a little daunting. It's obviously very complex. But what I found was to tell the story and to ground the story in what I know best, which is my Filipino-American family's experience here. My mother is a nurse who, because of the 1965 Immigration Act, Hart-Celler lifted quotas for immigrants throughout the world and especially throughout Asia. And so she was recruited to come here and became a professional caregiver. And so care has always been something that I've been thinking about. And it's because of my parents and how I was raised that I think have always been concerned with these issues. So I'm gonna stop talking and just read now. And this is the first time, these ideas have lived in my mind for years, but this is really the first time that I get to share it out loud. So that's really exciting, and I feel like to have been invited by Anne, I feel like this is a safe space to kind of test some stuff out. So I might pause here and there to explain some things, and I'm just gonna ask you to roll with it. This feels like a very safe place to sort of debut these thoughts and ideas. Okay, so this is from a chapter called Mothering as Valuable Labor. When my parents emigrated to the United States in 1970, they came alone with very few belongings. I tried to imagine them, just 25 and 27 years old, each following someone else's plan for their lives. They had known each other less than a year, and their first home together was a cramped apartment in Philadelphia, a city whose cold winters were a shock to their sun-warmed systems. My paternal grandmother, Ima, had offered to send someone with them, a domestic worker, to help with cooking, cleaning, and eventually childcare. My dad's family didn't have a lot of money, but in the Philippines, having domestic help isn't uncommon, whether or not you are wealthy. My mom declined the offer, which I imagine could not have been easy. Ima, along with my grandfather Tatang, had grown a palenque stand where they bartered imported American goods, such as Marlboros, for produce, into a corner market, and then into a supermarket, and finally a local wholesale market, a la Costco. Ima birthed 7 children and worked at the store 7 days a week until she was 100 years old. She is a formidable woman. I grew up with maids, Angela, my mother says, dismissing the idea that it was a difficult decision. They hear everything you say. She wanted privacy, she says, and she wanted to be accountable to the family she was building with my father. Whatever mistakes I made, whatever happens to my kids, it's my responsibility. She adds that she didn't want to be responsible for another person. My mother is the 7th of 9 children. Her father was a doctor, but, she says, he wasn't particularly ambitious. The family needed more than just his salary to survive. My maternal grandmother, Lola Lily, was, in my mom's words, a hustler and an entrepreneur. When she fell in love with and married my grandfather, Lola Lily put her plans to go to medical school and become a doctor on hold. She channeled that drive into making ends meet, picking up work as a seamstress, operating a small salon in their home, crocheting and selling her creations. Eventually, she opened a pharmacy, taught chemistry on the faculty of Philippine Women's University, and became the first treasurer of the university's credit union. My mother was amazing, my mom says, but she wasn't a hands-on, touchy-feely kind of woman. Because Lola Lily was always working, my mom was raised by women named Inga and Nati, domestic workers who were full-time live-in nannies, cooks, and maids. She remembers Inga fondly, though she also remembers Inga's husband, a man who made her and her 5 sisters uncomfortable because he always seemed to be watching them. She knows what it's like to be raised by someone other than your mother, and she didn't want that for my brothers and me. Nearly 50 years after my parents emigrated, an article titled "My Family's Slave" was published posthumously by writer Alex Tizon in The Atlantic. Tizon recounts his relationship with a woman he called Lola, who, it turns out, was not a family elder, as the name suggests, but, he concludes, an enslaved person. She was 18 years old when my grandfather gave her to my mother as a gift. And when my family moved to the United States, we brought her with us, Tizon writes. As I read, I wondered if my mother had, on some level years ago, been aware that she was avoiding a similar situation, of being not only responsible for someone else, but the fact that that someone may have joined her family not entirely of their own will. Having domestic help would no doubt have made my mom's life easier. She worked outside the home for my entire childhood, long 8+ hour days. But my parents took some satisfaction in doing it on their own, buying into the American ethos of individualism, pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. It made for long hours, sore bodies, and sometimes a lonely life. But that was their American dream. When we went back to the Philippines, adjusting to having domestic help was strange. Someone scurrying to cook breakfast as soon as you were up, telling us to leave our dishes on the table, retrieving dirty clothes from our room at some unknown and undetected time, and then leaving them washed and neatly folded on the edge of our beds. As a kid, I was confused by their roles in the household, how I was supposed to interact with them, especially because of a language barrier. As I got older, I felt even more uncomfortable. I had been raised to clear my plate, wash dishes on my designated night, to separate whites from colors, to put away my laundry. I'm not your maid, my mother would tell us. But in the Philippines, there was always a maid, and my ima, who scared me, would bark at us to let them do their work. At first, I saw the relationship as only one of power and subservience, but over the years, life has complicated that impression. Over time, I saw my mother begin to defer to the domestic workers' authority. It's their job, she told me later. Refusing to let them do it, however well-intentioned, felt insulting and disrespectful. Who am I to say I can do their job better than them, she said. I can't. My mom stays out of their way now, but she always brings gifts for each woman in her balikbayan boxes, usually Victoria's Secret lotions, soaps, and body sprays. And I'm pretty sure she slips them cash at the end of every trip, just as we're about to leave for the airport. At Ima's house, Ate Nancy was in charge of the kitchen for many years. When I crave bulalo, tinola, and mungo, it's Ate Nancy's version that I want. Eventually, Nancy left Ima's house and set up her own canteen restaurant adjacent to the supermarket. She's still very much a part of the scene. She'll show up in the kitchen to supervise some cooks, and we hired her to babysit our youngest daughter during a family party. Ate Celia has worked for my Tita Jeannie for over 50 years. She's been there for the births and care of 3 of my cousins, all of whom are in their 40s now. Celia was there through the sudden death of the family patriarch, Tito Albert, and all the grief that still penetrates the family. I believe she is loved dearly. I love her. She is small but so physically strong, which manifests in the sturdiest, most comforting hug. The first time I came back to the Philippines with my oldest daughter, I couldn't wait to introduce her to Ate Celia, who immediately picked her up to play with her. On another trip, when Noli was a toddler, she wore a turquoise gingham blouse, the straps of which kept falling off her shoulder. Unbeknownst to me, Celia found the blouse and shortened the straps, hand sewing them. I was touched and grateful, but I also wasn't sure how to feel. Had she done it out of love or a sense of obligation? I want to ask her if we feel the same affection for each other, but I don't have the language, and for that, I feel stupid and ashamed. But it's not simply a language barrier that stands in our way. Even if I did speak fluent Tagalog, how do you speak across a power differential? Is it possible to ever get to the truth of the relationship? In the United States, domestic work is defined by invisibility, treated as an afterthought. It's marked by shame. The shame my mother rejected when she chose not to bring a domestic worker to America. It is also marked by people's sense of entitlement, that they should have access to this cheap, essential labor. And there is the expectation that Black and brown women doing this work should stay hidden to keep the system running smoothly. Typically, these women don't appear in photos with the children they care for because they are the ones taking the picture of families, or because they are busy doing something else entirely. According to Oxfam, if women around the world made minimum wage for all the unpaid hours of care work they performed in 2019, they would have earned $10.9 trillion. In America alone, $10.9 trillion. Let's just sit with that figure. And in America alone, they would have earned $1.5 trillion. But because care work remains unpaid, these astounding numbers do not factor into gross domestic product or economic growth. How did we get to this place where essential work is so devalued? 2 crucial lenses to view care work through are capitalism, the system in which trade and industry are privatized and controlled by owners for profit, and colonization, the action of taking control of the land and indigenous people of an area. At the heart of both lies the impulse to draw a distinct line between beings with power and beings to be nominated, to create cultural binaries of civilized versus natural, modern versus primitive, with what is supposedly civilized and modern being superior. The rise of capitalism gave us the idea that most women, indigenous peoples, slaves, and colonized people everywhere were not fully human, and thus not full members of society, right? Economists Raj Patel and Jason W. Moore. These were people who were not, or were only barely, human. Classifying a huge swath of the population in this way allowed their lives and labor to be cheapened. Reproductive labor is all the work needed to sustain a productive labor force for generations. It includes caring for children, adults, and the elderly, household chores, keeping everyone in the household emotionally and physically healthy. Reproductive labor can be performed by mothers, other family members, or hired workers. The common denominator is that the work is either unpaid or low wage. Many classify the work as unskilled, which I think is a myth used to perpetuate a class system that designates some people as less worthy than others. While associations of caregiving with women in the domestic sphere and quote-unquote real work with the money activities outside of the home, those run deep, but they're actually fairly recent concepts, historically speaking. The division between home and workplace didn't exist in feudal Europe, where women worked as doctors, butchers, teachers, retailers, and smiths, writes the labor journalist Sarah Jaffe. Under capitalism, though, their work was defined as a natural resource, laying outside the sphere of market relations. So placing reproductive labor outside the capitalist sphere is what upholds the entire system. Mothers and caregivers participate in this arrangement by force, if necessary. If those who do professional work had to commensurately pay the care workers who made their work possible, there would be less profit to be made. Without us, the whole system falls apart. The work of mothering, of reproductive labor, remains out of sight and out of mind because it occurs in the home. This private, domestic space is deemed the domain of women, and the extent of our political and social power is expected to be exercised there. Household managers, volunteer PTA members. Patel and Moore call this confinement of women, which began in the 17th century, the Great Domestication. Domestication moved people away from a more communal way of living and took away the social and connective aspects of all labor. Men ventured out and worked for employers in fields and factories and earned an individual wage. Women stayed in and oversaw the home, where they kept men fed and comfortable and gave birth to the next generation of workers. This paved the way for the promotion of the nuclear family as the primary way to organize our lives. A single household unit with private property, a wife was considered property, where the children she raised became the way to protect and pass down wealth. This arrangement cemented the notion that domestic work is women's work, natural and good, done with no expectation of compensation. You've probably heard it called a labor of love. The modern neoliberal nuclear family, with its ethos of each household going it alone, prevails today. After the Great Depression, which left so many Americans destitute, the federal government stepped in to help families. To that end, the New Deal established an American family wage, a guaranteed minimum wage that would be enough to support a working husband, a housewife, a couple of children. This seems like a great idea, right? But this grand idea was doomed in predictably American ways. Southern lawmakers didn't believe that Black men and women should be entitled to the same wages and opportunities as white people. So these labor protections and this guaranteed wage excluded two types of laborers: agricultural workers, the majority of whom are Black men, and domestic workers, the majority of whom were Black women. So little progress has been made toward fair pay for domestic work. I'm just going to stop here and just drop a few stats on you right away. So 92% of domestic workers are women, 57% of them are Black, Latinx, or Asian American or Pacific Islander. Women of color are 20% of the United States population. They are 40% of all child care workers. Child care workers, many of whom are mothers, are 3 times more likely to live in poverty than any other profession. I just want that one to sit in, because that's a big one for me. And here's the other little stat I want to drop, is that the median wage for workers in the United States is about $20 an hour. For domestic workers, the median wage is $12 an hour. And the lowest wage of all is for nannies, who make $11.60 an hour as the median wage. So, yeah, I think the numbers speak for themselves. Since the 1960s, when women's liberation encouraged women to find meaning and power in their lives by pursuing work outside of the home, their participation in the wage workforce has steadily risen. But as Jaffe notes, in the current age when many women work both outside and inside the home, we hear a lot about work-life balance, but not enough about how, for everyone, life, code for family, means unpaid work. We like to tell ourselves that American women are better off, freer than other women around the world, in part because they can easily work outside the home. But we are never free or unburdened from other people. We are dependent on our nannies, cleaners, personal Instacart shoppers, DoorDash delivery drivers, mothers, and in-laws. The domestic load is as heavy as ever, but if we have the means, we spread it out among multiple people. This is not real progress. White women's reliance on the low-wage labor of women of color actually deepens racial inequities in America and around the world. I'm Panay, my husband is white, and we have relied on my mother's unpaid labor, as well as the paid labor of immigrants and Latinx, Black, and Chinese women to care for our children. I continue to navigate my place as an American woman of color who is financially privileged. I have been mistaken by strangers for my light-skinned daughter's caretaker, which has angered me and also forced me to question why it makes me angry. This tension has made me bold, willing to speak out in solidarity with caregivers in some instances. At other times, it's made me quiet and embarrassed. I can claim otherness. I know it intimately. But I have also always known that if things fall apart, I could ask for help, that I would never be left destitute or totally alone. In the midst of the pandemic, at an emotional low, I entered the hours I spent caring for my family and our home into an online invisible labor calculator to see how much my work might be worth. You can Google this and you can do it yourself, and I would totally encourage you to do that. It was created by the journalist Amy Westervelt, who used Bureau of Labor statistics data to assign an hourly wage to different tasks: washing dishes, considering the emotional needs of family members, doing yard work, cooking, etc. I was floored when the calculator told me my annual wage should be over $300,000, which would make being a domestic worker the highest paying job I have ever had, by far. I'm going to switch gears, but the way this chapter goes, I really think that if mothers and caregivers, those who mother, which is to me like mothering is the action, right? It's not like the state of motherhood that is like what you do. It's caring and nurturing, so this is not gender specific. It's not specific to parents. It can include anyone who is engaged in this work, and which should really be everyone. Keeping the human species alive and continuing is sort of something that we're all somewhat invested in. But I really see this chapter really kind of dives deep more into domestic work and the reality of domestic workers, because I think it's an opportunity for solidarity, where I think that the issue, we are not different from our nannies. We are not different from people who clean our homes. We are not different from anyone who we kind of like to think that we're somehow different from. And I think if we were actually to be able to, there's a lot of great organizing going on in that field, and if we were to actually build solidarity with them and see ourselves as not separate, that to me is a very powerful place of class solidarity, and I think it's really a way forward that we need to be thinking more about. Okay, so speaking of other ways forward, I'm going to jump ahead to, this is the next part I'm going to read is from chapter 4, which is mothering as human interdependence. Okay. The texture of my childhood is brown, plush, and abundant. Upholstered bucket seats and a back seat that unfolded into a bed 3 kids could lie down on. Our family logged seemingly endless hours and miles in our van, a living room on wheels, carpeted with blinds and a removable faux wood drink table holder. My brother Jay and I climbed the ladder on its back to stunt for family photos on the roof. I ate so many Filet-O-Fish sandwiches and chicken McNuggets with hot mustard sauce en route to Buffalo, New York City, or Scarsdale, New York, to visit my dad's brother, Uncle Ging, and his wife, Aunt Kathy, or my mom's sister Tita Fan, my cousin, Atabani, or another one of my mom's sisters, Tita Jeannie. She and her husband, Tita Albert, had 5 kids, and the youngest, Len, was my very favorite cousin. Her family lived in the Philippines, but spent a few years in the States in the 1980s, during which we saw them as often as possible. At Thanksgiving and Christmas tables overflowing with turkey and mashed potatoes, but also chicken embutido, siopao, and bibingka, we'd be joined by various family members who flew in from Canada and California. Lola Lily, my grandmother, the family matriarch, Tita Nene, an inscrutable older sister who almost became a nun and now lived in the same building as Lola, Tita Tessie, my ninong and fellow bunso, a free spirit from Berkeley, and her daughters Monique and Danielle, And if we were lucky, the oldest Zaragoza sister, Tita Baby, and her husband Tito Pons would make the trip from West Covina, along with one or more of their 4 kids. I had a particular affection for Tita Baby. I loved her smile and her soft skin and saw myself in her round face. And her only daughter, my Atadali, because their family had briefly lived with ours when they first immigrated to America. At the time, I was just 2 years old, while Tita Baby's kids were high schoolers. Always laughing, they'd tell me the same story over and over and over. How I had invented my own word, abukania, which I'd use to express delight or anger, depending on my toddler mood, with exaggerated body language, facial expressions, and tone. That, as a child, I created a private language for my emotions feels very core to who I am. So I'm grateful to them for giving me this memory that I could never have on my own. Holidays and summer vacations and impromptu weekends were joyous and cacophonous. I have no idea what the adults did all that time, and I don't care. I passed the hours playing spit, jumping rope, making stop-motion animation videos with toys and clay figures, defending myself from the torment of my kuyas, doing karaoke on the -1 machine. We cousins ran feral and free until mealtime, when we'd all come together, and the titos would drink beer and tease us, and the titos would set the table and make chismes. Atacelia was always there too, corralling kids, laughing her loud, easy laugh, washing the dishes. Nighttime was a big slumber party, 3 or 6 of us girls squeezed into one room. Sometimes I'd wake to go pee in the night and find Lenlen sleepwalking through the dark hallways in her yellow nightgown. At the end of each trip, I'd crawl reluctantly back into the van, heavier now thanks to a cooler filled with leftovers, and we'd make our way home. Those drives were as silent as the white lines of the highway. Our house in rural Pennsylvania was comfortable and spacious, but quiet. I'd take the bus home after school, walk the half-mile down our gravel road to an empty house. We were latchkey kids, and my brothers had very little interest in playing with me, so I'd walk in our backyard woods and lie down on a large patch of moss that I thought of as my own personal rug, to look up at the tall hemlocks and daydream. Inside, you can't do that on television, Kate and Allie and Growing Pains were my companions. One or both of my parents were always home in time to make dinner, and it was important to them that we sat down together every night to Filipino food if they had the time, or hamburger helper if they didn't. I had friends, of course, but we lived out in the country, not in town or close to any of them. I viewed community as something that we lacked, though I know that's not entirely true. I wanted to live somewhere else, maybe Berkeley, where my Filipina Belgian cousins had friends named Aram, or who were Jewish. Or New York City, where there was an entire neighborhood of Asian people and dim sum, and I might have a chance to be cool, like the editors of Sassy magazine. I dreamt of West Covina, Daly City, and Stockton. I dreamed of living any place with large Filipino communities, with a Philippine grocery store, or just a Jollibee or a Goldilocks bakery. What, I wondered, would I be like if I was from Milpitas? It felt on some level that if I felt on some level that I actually belonged. And I wondered, what would my parents be like if they could speak their first languages, Tagalog and Kapampangan, every day? If they could buy ampalaya leaves and makapuno ice cream at the supermarket and run into friends while shopping? We all turned out fine. Not unscathed, but fine. My parents loved us wholly and generously, which goes a long way. But they were focused on survival and fitting in, and so it seemed to me were my brothers. While I was slurping sinigang and spitting out pork neck bones, my brother Jay wanted Roman meal bread with Smucker's goober grape spread. Neither he nor our oldest brother Pete seemed keen to join my dad on his yearly trip to the Philippines, where he would visit his parents and drink San Miguel beer with his brothers, while I played with dozens of cousins each day, buying sodas in plastic bags from street vendors, skin polka-dotted red with mosquito bites, and developing a nice deep tan. No, it was only me who seemed plagued by noticing the differences, who always wondered if people were making fun of my parents or my family, who knew there was no hope of ever fitting in, not really, and resenting our little town, wanting more. When I was younger, I was told that the United States was a melting pot of people and cultures around the world. I think a lot of us, probably my age, were told that, and Thankfully, we're not told that anymore. That followed the model of assimilation. Vanish and be accepted under the identity of American, without realizing that meant become white and sacrifice some of who you are. Eventually, we started talking about America as a salad bowl, many different elements together making a whole without losing distinct identity. But for many people, children of immigrants and quote-unquote white Americans too, it's not so simple. Our histories and ways of life have been deliberately purged from the historical record, and we must deliberately seek them out. Central to pre-colonial Philippine culture is bayanihan, which means communal solidarity. Its roots lie in the shared labor of farming, child-rearing, house building, and house moving. Throughout Philippine folk art, you'll find a recurring image of a group of people moving a nipa hut hoisted on bamboo sticks, a la Cleopatra being carried on a litter. In a tropical monsoon-heavy climate, flooding is not uncommon. So through bayanihan, a community could literally lift up and relocate a home and move it to higher ground. So bayanihan, according to historian Louis H. Francia, was the cornerstone of indigenous Filipino communities known as barangays. In this social context, producers owned their own means of production, and any surplus from a bountiful harvest was stored against a rainy day or for barter. In a word, the archipelagic barangay was not only pre-colonial, but also pre-capitalist. Francia cites the Banawe rice terraces, which many Filipinos, like me, were raised to proudly call the eighth wonder of the world, which were built by the Ifugao people of northern Luzon. He says this is an impressive and enduring example of bayanihan. Carved out of the rock of the Cordillera Mountains at treacherous heights and angles, the terraces, which are still in use today, required tremendous coordination and effort to build. Organizing the labor, building up the patties, devising the placement of rocks and irrigation canals were daunting challenges that required a tight, cohesive, and efficient social structure, he writes. In modern American culture, that sort of tight-knit community structure seems increasingly rare. For centuries, extended personal networks have been eroded, replaced with privatized jobs and small, isolated kin units. Neoliberal family life has turned the very idea of accountability to others into a dreadful burden, writes sociologist Catherine Jetzer Morton. If you're looking to optimize your schedule for maximum efficiency, having to pause and account for someone else's pace and needs, someone who isn't even related to you, throws a spanner in the works. I am not trying to romanticize or fetishize the past, but the simple fact is that for centuries throughout the world, we lived communally. Having individual families siloed off from one another, out of sight and out of mind, is a relatively recent social structure that we accept. This model has been forced upon us at a steep cost to parents and children. What would it take to go back? Not go back in time, but to really look back, understand other cultures, cultures under threat of erasure, cultures subjected to force and exploitation, resilient cultures that continue to thrive despite colonization, and glean wisdom from them. We don't need to recreate social structures wholesale, but we could learn more from communal aspects of living, use them to rethink and reshape American family life. The American dream is based on the idea that freedom is about being unburdened from others, having the power to do whatever we want, whenever we want. It is deeply individualistic. But as Mia Birdsong explains in her book, How We Show Up, Reclaiming Family, Friendship, and Community, there is an older understanding of freedom that we must rediscover. The words free and friend are derived from the Indo-European fria, which means beloved. Freedom, Birdsong writes, was originally the idea that together we can ensure that we have all the things we need: love, food, shelter, safety. Freedom is not an individual effort, but a collective one. Being free, writes Birdsong, is achieved through being connected. So whether we're a melting pot or a salad bowl or just a dynamic, strange collection of people, one redeeming quality of America is that we might be able to pick and choose from the rich assemblage of cultures that make up our country's population, the family values and the practices that work for us. We can reject systems that are failing us, and we can forge new ones, steeped in traditions that are still alive and well. Initially, I wrote that a scarcity mindset created by the American myths of exceptionalism and self-made individuals who can overcome every obstacle are what prevented my parents and other immigrants like them from connecting with others, from having the support they needed. But now I can recognize that that impulse to say that is a product of my own cultural conditioning. This American doctrine is what stops white Americans and any people with any kind of social power from being able to see themselves in anyone different or less fortunate than them. It is white America's inability, its lack, that gets in the way of progress, of dynamic community building, and the care that we all deserve. And that's it. Thank you.
Gosh, you're so smart. And should have warned you we were going to have a conversation after her reading, so that's what's happening now.
And then you guys, if you have questions, get to ask too. So.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But first, us.
With my, I don't have, so my jumpsuit does not have pockets, which is like criminal. And so I have this, I have a little like technological pooch here.
I like the techno pooch. That's the name of our band. Thank you for just giving us a look into this book. I'm so excited.
Sure.
When is it coming out?
It is coming out May 10th, 2022.
Mother's Day, probably.
Yeah, very close to Mother's Day. Yes.
Okay.
Thinking like a capitalist.
Thinking like
my publisher, yeah.
Thinking like a Hallmark salesperson.
Yeah, I mean, I love the idea of someone getting this as a Mother's Day gift for someone because it's not.
It's like,
it's
your work is undervalued. Here's a book.
Yeah, maybe it will spark a. Well, you know, actually, Mother's Day it's the origin of it. There was a woman, I forget her name now, a white woman. She like campaigned, like did this intense letter writing campaign to like, because she was like, we don't acknowledge women's unpaid work. And she never had children, but she loved her mother, and so she went on this whole thing. And because of her, like, you know, this kind of stuff works, like letter writing campaigns, knocking on doors. She actually won this as like a local thing, and then it became like a federal holiday. And then she became incredibly disillusioned with the hallmarkization of honoring mother's work, that she she boycotted all flower shops for the rest of her life.
Oh my God.
And
Oh,
yeah,
poor thing.
It was a journey.
Yikes. I'm going to add a little nick of trivia that Hallmark is a family-run company, and it's still a family-run company. It's like generational, and they're in Kansas City, Missouri.
Okay.
Yeah, it's the Halls. Hallmark. Well, I wanted to start actually with I have so many things I want to say.
Okay.
I love this discussion that you've started around the problems of individualism tying directly into capitalist thinking, and how our work and our communities have been atomized by these sort of systems that are designed to keep us uncommunal, individualized, but also like anti-communal, right?
Yeah.
And at the same time, the structure of your writing, because I've had a chance to read the manuscript, is also communal. You're invoking a lot of really necessary voices, you know, and simply speaking, you're citing a lot of really amazing thinkers and people I don't think about. I mean, people I was not aware of, and people I also am not thinking about. So I really commend you on the ability to create this, it's almost like an almanac of information, right? Like here are the people in my ecosystem who are talking about this. And
I like that way of thinking about it, because I think in my mind, I'm in conversation with a lot of people.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm just sitting there talking to myself. Yeah.
So you've gone crazy, totally understandable. Like a Mother, your other book is also I feel like I was also just very collaborative. You're talking to a lot of people from different parts of the pregnancy industry.
Right.
Yeah.
The motherhood industrial complex.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Industrial complex is such a great suffix phrase. Yeah.
Yeah, you can try it out. It applies to almost anything. So.
Yeah. The iced coffee industrial complex. But maybe, do you want to tell us a little bit about what it, was that a transformed thought process for you to go from, did you experience a sort of reckoning with your own dealing with individualism versus collectivism and communalism?
God, that's such a good question. Because it makes me reflect, like, it's one of those questions I don't have an answer to. I'm like, what is my process? Like, why do I do what I do? I would say that I think the number one thing is, like, I became a writer, like, I've 100% moved into writing with a giant chip on my shoulder, which was that, like, I consumed books, magazines, media, like, I love that stuff. And I never saw it. I mean, representation is like the least of what we can ask for, but I literally was like, I never see anyone that looks like me. I never like hear stories about families like mine. And so I, in many ways, like, became a writer because I wanted to, like, write myself into these stories that I care about. I wanted to write people that I knew. I wanted there to be a record, like, we were here, like, my parents were here, like, we were all here.
Yeah.
And so that definitely is part of it. And then, you know, like, which is, I think, very much my style, and I think it's very intuitive, thank you for noticing, like, it's just that it brings a lot of different threads together. Like, I read a lot of poetry, right? Like, I'm really interested in, like, you know, like, what do art people say about this? Like, how does this tie into money? It always comes down to money, right? So I'm pulling from a lot of sources, and part of that is, this book is a big step for me because it's a lot more. I wanted to, like, share a lot of my family history, but I ended up became a much more personal book than I expected, which is exciting but also terrifying. But I wanted to do that because I think I need to insist on the value of my own story. But, and I'm assuming that people here will relate to this, I have, you know, internalized racism to the point, and sort of, like, you know, internalized whiteness to the point where I really believe, like, I could never write a memoir. Like, I could never write a book just about my life because I don't, honestly, it's like, I just don't believe anyone would care that much. Like, I don't believe that people would want that. And I know I'm supposed to be writing just for myself. People of color are told this all the time, like, forget your audience, like, it has to be meaningful just to you. And I think that that's true. I think maybe I'm too old to get there, right? Like, I don't know. There's something where, to me, I feel like everything I do in my writing is like an act of service. And so that way it's like how I show love, like, to the world, right? But the thing about that is, like, for it to be an act of service, it's like my story, which I hope will resonate with a lot of people like me, but it's an emotional access point. And then it's like, if you can bring someone in, which is what I do, then I'm like, let me hit you with these stats, you know, like, let me tell you that, like, you know, 97% of, like, domestic, you know, it's like this kind of stuff. Like, it's this way of, I don't want it to be just my voice. And I think there's also this consciousness around, like, as someone who's, like, self-identified as a feminist since, like, age 12, but has always been like, but, like, women of color are here, right? Like, that feeling of being left behind by, like, mainstream feminism, or even, like, you know, subcultures. It's that feeling of, like, I just never want to leave anyone behind.
Right.
And so it's always wanting to draw in other voices because I can talk about what I know, but, like, I don't know what I don't know.
Yeah.
And the only way for me to know what I don't know is to talk to people different from me, to engage in the work of writers who are thinking about things that I'm not thinking about.
I love that. I feel like we must all have this experience of the delight, whether it's something really petty and, you know, small or huge, of just seeing somebody's face recognize themselves in something, like, oh, do you know about this thing, right? And I say petty because sometimes it can be like, you don't know about this thing, but then the other side of it of, like, especially working with younger folks at this organization, just like, oh my God, when they find out about Asian American art, and you can see their heads explode, it's the best feeling. And I love that. So I love that you're providing the head explosion for people reading, you know, like, oh my God.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of it is, like, maybe, like, it's that feeling of, like, when you're watching that is really like, oh, and I've let go of this, but part of it is that, like, what I would have given to have had this experience that you're having right now, like, as a child. And so I think it's that, like, I want to give people moments like that, for sure, because I desperately needed them. It comes down to my needs, but, like, and that's what I want to put into the world, the things that I felt were missing from it, you know, the things that I wanted to see.
Something a vendor today upstairs said that I just want to share is, like, a word of comfort for anybody who feels like their stories are not valuable. Chin Agoyo, part of We Are the Seeds, Narragansett Chinese Native American artist, And he makes jewelry, he makes instruments, he's a performer, writer, just all of those things, right? And he's like, the reason why Native Americans are so creative is because we have to be, because nobody else is going to make this stuff. Some of it is because nobody else should, and a lot of it is nobody else wants to.
Right.
So we have to. We have no choice. We're the only people who are going to tell this story, right? Your story, my story, our story. The other thing I wanted to say was, you said something really cool. What would it take to go back? Juxtaposed with you had just said, I don't want to fetishize the past or like, you know, toxic nostalgia, et cetera. But I feel like one of the you know, we're able to go back and able to kind of maybe course correct places where we became broken.
Yeah.
By doing exactly what you're describing, which is passing on this information, which then leads to care, right? That's really kind of what's happening. And for me, I've come to terms with the fact that, yes, some of what I'm doing by having a child and raising a family and supporting other people is living vicariously through them, absolutely. Just like 100%. Yes, I actually do have aspirations for all of these young people.
Yeah.
I am projecting what I wish I could have had.
Yes,
and
I
that's
think
not
there's this
bad.
Yeah, there's this idea where our initial reaction is to be like, am I being selfish? Like,
Right.
did I have a child to like produce like myself in the world? And it's like, no, because it's so clear when they come out that you don't really have that much control over who they are. They're doing their own thing. But I think that it's, you know, people who like think universal childcare and like paid leave are like bad policies, like, sorry, those people. But like people who think that that like have that idea that like having children is somehow selfish or something, I actually think it's really like, to me, like having children is such a profound act of hope, and it's like ego death in many ways. It's very like, you have to believe, like this is what I think anyway, like I have to believe that like a better world is possible and that I want to work for that, even though like most likely like I probably won't be around to see it.
Right.
You know, and I think that there's something very like, I don't know, I think that that's an important thing, like to be able to see I feel bad for people who can't relate to having a relationship with young people, whether it's their own children, you know, or not, because it's really like, what are you about?
Yeah.
Right? Like the idea that you're here just to be here, not to contribute something to, you know, and you don't have to have children to do that.
Right. I think I would place emphasis on that it doesn't require you having the children.
Yes.
Life is going to happen with or without us, right? And then to take a more sort of spiritual approach to it, our jobs as human beings, the only job is to be alive, right? So how do we make sure that happens?
Care, by the way.
Care, yeah. A thing that you bring up a lot in your writing that I really love, just pleasure. The importance of pleasure. Yeah. So let's talk about pleasure.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot more pleasure in the book. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. So,
I love that because that's another aspect of mothering, child caregiving. The phrase sounds weird. Caregiving.
It's
right?
weird, right? So I don't know where this comes from. It's like we use them sort of interchangeably, caregiving and caretaking.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's like I've spun out at times, like when I've been high, being like,
same.
Is that like the mother-child dyad? Like,
yeah.
You know, like I don't know who's giving, who's taking, but it is interesting because I found myself being like, do I want to use caregiving? Is there a difference, caretaking?
I did the same exact thing. We were probably taking the same drugs. Just like, okay, what is it? Giving or taking? Mothering has to be divorced from pleasure. Like that there's something.
I mean, I would die if it had to be divorced from pleasure.
Yeah. You said something in like a mother just rang such a strong bell in me of like, I'm in love with this child. Like it is not just, I'm not going to try to distinguish it being of, you know, my maternal affection. It's like, I'm in love with them.
I was thrown off when I first had a child that I felt like and it's very different for everyone. Like some people don't have that instinctual connection, or like not instinctual, that immediate connection. It varies, right? Sometimes it develops later for people. But like I was like, whoa, this is weird. Like this reminds me so much more of romantic love than I thought, right? And there's like, you know, I was like, is this creepy? Like, but I don't think so, because on a hormonal level, like it is the same hormones that are going on, right? Like, so there's that, you know, the same oxytocin, which is the hormone that you feel when you are breastfeeding, when you experience letdown, is the same hormone that is released when you orgasm. So I mean, that's like,
Yeah.
that's just a biological fact. So I think that it's like, I think what I've found is like no one wants to like kind of untangle that because it's that instinctive thing like, is this creepy?
Right.
Like, but why not enjoy like,
I
you're this
wanna-
person, you want to enjoy them in this way,
Right.
you know, still having boundaries, obviously.
Right.
But yeah, I think that we're supposed to see motherhood as like totally, it's like the work is like self-sacrificing, like body denial.
Totally.
You know, but I think it's really, part of what I wanted to do in this book is like, I mean, it was, to me it's very much a pandemic book, though it's not specifically about the pandemic. But you know, the first 4 months of the pandemic, I was home with my children 24/7. We didn't go anywhere besides like outside in our house. And I had this feeling of like, care work is killing me. Like I've flattened my life. I'm nothing but a caregiver. And the pleasure that I used to take in caregiving seemed to really just be like draining from my life. And so part of this book was thinking about in this last year and a half when parents have been like really struggling. Like if you have friends, if you are a parent, like you know, it's been unlike anything else. But part of this was writing the pleasure back into it. Like what does it feel like to let go of all of the stress? And if we were to be present in our caregiving, in our bodies, like it's actually really, it's very fun, it's very sensual, it's...
Totally. Yeah, it's ecstatic. I came up with this metaphor the other day. I just wanted... my friend has fitness hula hoops. Have you seen these?
No, but I can imagine.
Yeah, they're just basically hula hoops for middle-aged women, like us. So she had two. One was bigger and heavier, and one was smaller and lighter. And I was like, "What? You know, what's the deal?" And she's like, "Oh, it's great exercise. You can just kind of do it while you're watching TV." So I picked up the smaller one, thinking it was going to be easier. And then I was spinning it, and she's like, "Oh no, the heavier one is easier." And I was like, what? But she was totally right. The light one was almost impossible. I was like, this is really hard. I'm like kind of working really hard to get there. And for me, there's something there about balance, obviously. Like it's about finding equilibrium. But that the heavier the hula hoop, you know what I mean? Like there's something about giving those aspects that we think need to be lighter, like what happens if we actually switch the balance dynamic around? So with pleasure especially, I've been really fixated on this idea of like, actually the heavier the pleasure, the easier the work becomes. So like when I say this to caregivers and people with really high responsibilities for people, for humans, those are the only responsibilities that really matter, right? That actually, that self-care, I hate that phrase, but you know, has to be heavy or you cannot perform your job. Like, you know, the hula hoop has to be big. And the hula hoop in this metaphor is something like pleasure, you know, sensuality, fuck everybody and spending time alone, you know, all of that stuff.
Well, there's the, so I was gonna say, like, the idea of self-care, you've probably all, I think it's like, been memed now at this point, but you know, like Audre Lorde said that, you know, self-care is it's like an act of warfare, a political warfare, right? It's not like some light thing. But, you know, I read her a lot when I was writing this book in this concept of pleasure, and there's you know, the third chapter is all about, it's about mothering as erotic labor, but erotic in the Audre Lorde sense, which is one of the things that she's saying, what you were saying about the heaviness is like one of the things she said, the erotic is like not just about feeling, it's about how deeply, I'm gonna massacre the quote, but it's like how deeply we can feel in the doing. And that's what I was thinking about when
Totally.
you were
Deeply feeling in the doing.
It's like it's a getting in touch with like how deeply you can feel.
Yes.
And I think that there's something in caregiving that really is something that I've been thinking about. Like I've been obsessed with this idea of like what real work is. Like you were saying, like to me, like the only real work is like being alive, helping other people be alive, like enjoying your life. And I've always been like, I want my work to be real. And what I have found is actually caregiving, to me, is like some of the realest, most satisfying work I have ever done.
Yeah.
You know? And I don't want to be limited to only that as an identity. But if all I did was like care for the people I love, if that's all I do in my life, like I can die happy. You know, like it's the thing that's given my life the most meaning. And it's also given my life a lot of complexity and moments of like, what the fuck am I doing? And, but really, that all comes from, it's not my problem. It is that we live in this society that doesn't value this.
Right.
This fundamental thing that I think is essential to my, happiness, or like, and essential to like just sustaining life, that we have decided that it's even debatable as a country, as a society, that this is like, it's so infuriating. It's
Right.
so, and so it's like I feel out of step with the world in that way, but it's really, I know that I am not the problem.
Yeah.
It's like these systems that we have set up. It's really hard to live with that.
It is hard. It takes constant reminders, doesn't it? Just like, it's the system, it's not me.
Yeah.
There was an article by Ariel Levy in the New Yorker many years ago about Italy and mama, there's an Italian phrase, like the culture of worshiping mothers, and how it's a false positive, right? Like you think that means that women are respected, but in fact it's actually kind of creating this sort of false sense of respect for just motherhood specifically. Yeah. And she has this line, I'm gonna garble it a little bit, but along the lines of a culture in which a woman's highest power is their ability to produce children renders them inhuman, like makes them animals, right? And so I think about that a lot, because that's another way that we pervert this idea of how important it is to be the work of caregiving by fetishizing biological motherhood, right? And I don't know what I'm saying. I just wanted to put that.
Yeah, no,
out
I'm
there.
glad you said that. I'm just gonna
please
riff off of that. There's a feminist theorist. Thank you. Named Shulamith Firestone.
Yes.
Who did like work in like the 70s and 80s, and she at the time, like, people thought she was like, well, a little out there, like, all right, but she talked about how the only way that women could ever achieve equality is when, she envisioned this like future where babies were gestated like outside of the womb, and she was like, until we are done with biological motherhood, we can never have gender equity.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
Just tossing it out there. I'm
Yeah.
not trying to say that we have to do that, but it's something that I think about, because it's not I feel so strongly about how motherhood and being a mother and caring for people has like changed my life for the better, but I like know that's not for everyone. But it's like, how do we? Here's a question that I have, like, if I can just go here. Like, one of the things that I've been thinking about is, we do a lot of like, oh, go have date night and like, go live your life like a person that's single. Go live your life as someone who doesn't have children. And that's fine, like, parents want that, but like, what can we actually do? I mean this as a serious question. Like, what could we do as a society? Is there policy that we can develop that would encourage single people to live like people with dependents? Like, what would, you know what I mean? Like, can we mandate some kind of like service or something? I don't know. Like, I feel like it has to go both ways. It can't just be like, you're free because you get to like be without your family.
Yeah.
Like, what is it to know the pleasure of caring for someone?
Right.
What is it to know the pleasure of being invested in someone that you never expected to fall in love with?
I don't know. I don't want to go here, but I'm going to go here. I just think of all of these queerbo spaces of like, polyamorous communal living, and as a response where it's like, you're right, date night's a little ludicrous. Let's all just sort of have like, wobbly boundaries and live in the sort of openness of, breaking the monolith, breaking the whatever. And the reason I'm hesitating to go there is because I don't want to advocate for anything, but it is a way that I've seen people responding to just like a lot of confusion. What are we supposed to be doing?
I think it's kind of like what I was saying, this idea of like, we do not have to go back and be like, okay, I'm going to recreate to the best of my ability pre-colonial Philippine culture. Like, that's what I'm going to go do. That's my assignment. Like, no, I don't. But I think like I'm obsessed with this idea of homecoming, which I kind of alluded to in there. But so this idea, I didn't, in the chapter about human interdependence, I interviewed this woman named Dani McClain, who's an amazing writer and thinker, and she wrote a book called We Live for the We, The Political Power of Black Motherhood. And I interviewed her. She's an unpartnered parent, and she lives in Ohio and relies on her mother for care of her daughter. And during the pandemic, she was like, I needed her more than ever. And she was like, but at the beginning, she was like, I was having to negotiate with my former, the child's father, she's like, I didn't want to be like, where have you been? Who are you seeing? She was like, but there's all these like fuzzy boundaries and like, how do you negotiate that without being like a surveillance state? But she was like, what I kept thinking was like, what I really need is leadership from the polyamorous community, because she has friends who have lived like a polyamorous life for years,
Yeah.
and she was like, all they do is negotiate boundaries and like scheduling logistics and like how do you like respect people's freedom and like need for pleasure and like all of this stuff. And so it reminds me of that, where it's like these ideas, like we do not have to, like, also there's nothing wrong with promoting polyamory, but like this idea too of like we can just, America is built on like stealing culture, right, from other people. But what would it be to like respectfully like negotiate the terms with people, and to sort of like, again, it's like this, all of this stuff that we live with, like we don't have to live like this,
Right?
And
Totally.
it's not been that long that we've been living like this, and the way that our imaginations have been like stolen from us, or sort of like, or limited, is really, I just want that to be like, I want us to be like reclaiming that and trying it out. Like, I don't know. There's this phrase, I put it in the introduction of the book, where I'm like, right now I feel like we should be really free to experiment. Like all of our systems clearly are not working, right? Like we are living in a failed state. And so I feel like, why don't we try things? We might fail, but as the kids say, we can fuck around and find out.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's what I want to do.
Yeah.
That's what I think we need to be doing.
Totally.
Yeah.
There's a theory, you trace a lot of the brokenness in the caregiving system to capitalism, because it individualizes us. There's a theory that the reason we went so hard on monotheism is because there was this moment when men realized they can never know if they're the actual father of their children. And so creating a religion that forces people to obey a singular masculine deity translated into obeying a singular masculine paternal leader, right? And I think about that a lot, just because one of my alternative universes of care is it doesn't matter who the parents are. It actually doesn't. It doesn't matter who the father is. It might not even matter who the mother is. And these days in America, it only matters who the mother is. Right. It only matters whose uterus did the work, right? So that's just something I'm chewing on. Stupid systems. We have your friends are back.
Oh, hi. My daughter's back. Anique's back. Hello.
Another statistic I heard, I wanted to hear your thoughts on, this aspect of like there's so many Filipino nurses, right? Yeah. And I grew up really close to West Covina, and then went to school really close to Daly City. So I feel like and
my childhood fantasy lands.
Yeah, exactly. I'm your lived childhood fantasy. Filipino families raised me. Like my parents were at work till 10 p.m. and like it was anyway. So I'm bringing that up because, yes, I feel like every other Filipino person of in a generation was a nurse or worked in like, some kind of actual or domestic care or medical care. I read recently, or I heard somewhere, probably read, or anyway, that not only is it that there's so many nurses who are Filipino, but they elect into aspects of the work that require the most skin contact, right?
Yeah.
I don't remember where I got that, but I thought that was such an interesting statistic.
Well, it's interesting to me too, because it's, is it that they elected into it, or is it like those critical care positions are much more intimate and physical, and let's say like white nurses don't want that same level of contact? I think it's, I don't know what the answer is, but I think there's probably a little more complex.
Yeah.
Like those things are possible. And so, but because Filipinx nurses are like overly represented in critical care work, this is actually part of what really kind of started this whole process of this book being like, not just a history of care work in America and mothering. It became like very much rooted in like the Filipino American experience. This is just an insane statistic that, so 4% of the nursing workforce in America is Filipinx. 34% of nursing-related COVID deaths are Filipinx. So, and that's because when you work in critical care in an ICU, what you're doing, like for the last 20 months, it means that they've been taking care of specifically COVID patients. And this to me shows, like this is the extent to which we've devalued their lives. Yeah.
That's a heavy statistic. Yeah. It's sort of this like over leveraging of both the sort of assumption that we can work in a communal, in good faith, right? Like I think that's how nurses go into this work, is in good faith. And then those of us who depend on that care, not seeing it that way, not valuing that work. It's tough. Yeah, I don't really have a thought. Just, you're right. Yes, you're correct. That's, yeah. All right, what did I say in my notes? What else, what other smart things were you saying? Okay. Let's talk alternative solutions. You know, we've talked a little bit about that. Practically speaking, like, because one thing I think is also really clear in your writing is, and I think a lot of feminist writers in this sort of progressive feminists are talking about, like, it's no longer time for hypothesis and hypothetical, but the real, right? Like what's actually happening, and what matters is that we can speculate, but really the questions we need to answer have to do with like now and like what is going on. Let's not forgo people, period. So in the immediacy, I wonder if you see what are some bright lights we can look for in this broken system around like devalued, undervalued essential labor.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really, you know, I remember thinking at the beginning of the pandemic, like, I was like, if we survive this, it's not because like the government helped us. Like they sent us like $500 a month for a while, right? Like, but it's because people took care of each other. And I think the thing that gives me hope really is just that people are kind of doubling down and finding ways. It's the things that we naturally do as humans. The things that we want to do is to take care of other people, and people find ways to do that. This is, you know, sort of tangentially related, but you know, with the Supreme Court and hearing, you know, the Dobbs arguments, I have friends who are part of this organization called Shout Your Abortion, and what they're doing is like their message is, fuck, sorry, I keep saying fuck even though it's being broadcast, you know, like fuck SCOTUS, like we're doing this anyway. And their whole thing is like, the law is, we know that probably Roe is gonna fall, and abortion pills are accessible to everyone in 50 states, and it can be safely done. And so you can legally take away our rights, right? You can legally, you know, not give domestic workers, you know, protections. You can legally not guarantee like a living wage, but we're gonna do the shit we wanna do anyway. Like you cannot stop us from having abortions. Like, and so I kind of like take that as a way to sort of transfer it onto this caregiving. It's just like, you cannot stop me from taking care of my people, right? And you cannot stop as more people learn, I hope, this is my hope, it's like as more people learn the value of caregiving, right? Then people will be like, even, you know, like well-meaning, like upper class white people will be like, you cannot stop me from paying my domestic worker $25 or $35 an hour. You know, I think that people, if you expose them to the reality of like what this work costs people and what it is, like I really believe people want to do the right thing. I think it's a matter of like them being pushed, and then also like, I don't know exactly what the magic thing is, but I know that we are talking about like, I do know, like, you know, we're talking about care as infrastructure is a phrase that is in like the everyday conversation now, which was unthinkable 2 years ago. The idea of like a paid family leave, like 2 years ago when that other person was still our president, like these, like things change, right? That doesn't happen as quickly as I want. But I just think like care, when we lean into care, it is a really unstoppable human natural force that I think the more we talk about it, and I insist on always talking about it, and I would encourage everyone here to always be talking about it. You know, like what got me here today, like, I mean, I want to acknowledge the care of, I have another child who was left at home with my parents in Seattle. Like, we wouldn't be able to do this. You know, like, caregiving makes literally everything possible, and it's just, I think we just need to never shut up about it. Part of what makes it hopeful is we should never shut up about how this is making everything in our lives possible. And I just don't think you can, no matter how cruel, like, you can make this culture, no matter how inhumane you can try to, like, indoctrinate people into this, like, I still think, like, as most human beings, like, you can't stop them from caring.
Yeah. I have a controversial addendum to that idea. If we can take advantage of the fact that, and I have a theory that one of the reasons care's infrastructure is succeeding as a phraseology now is because more men are caretakers in the last 2 years, right? So if we just ride that train and just actually, if all women just left the house and it's going to happen anyway, it needs to happen anyway, what would it look like, you know, if we left? Because the other thing I'm hearing, and I'm being very deliberately binary and simplistic about this, but there's a trope, like, I come from a broken home, my mom raised me by herself. Most people I know don't have that person, you know, around. I'm hearing more and more about the other scenario of, like, mom wasn't around, and I'm somebody who's not around. Like, I'm at work all day. My partner is the one who takes care of our child all day. But I'm just curious what happens if no one's going to listen to a woman, then what would it look like if we forced men to be the people to be reckoned with, right? And I know that's not the answer, but it's just something I've thought about, because it's hilarious to me how much more deeply people care about our caregiving practice in my home because my husband is the one doing it. There's so much curiosity about it in a way that I'm 100% positive if I was the primary, no one would ask these questions.
Definitely.
Yeah.
How does that work exactly?
Yeah. Wait, so, like, he doesn't work? I'm like, actually, he does around the clock. I recognize that that's work, right?
Yeah.
Nobody else does.
I mean, I think it's an important point. I think, like, we need everyone sort of in this fight, right? And it's really hard to undo cultural norms. Like, they reside in us, even if we, as much as we want to be rid of them. But yeah, I think it's, like, my response to that is to just talk about how, I think that there was, like, some New York Times thing, I saw a bunch of people sharing it, where it was like, what caregiving, like, what taking parental leave does for fathers, and how it's, like, improves everyone's mental health. And, like, I mean, I'm sort of not waiting around for men to solve this problem, you know? Like, but I do think that it's really seeing how these systems, like, they affect women, and women of color most of all, because we are, like, undervalued, we're not paid, all of that. But, like, it's like what a binary like that does. Like, the gender binary punishes everyone. It punishes everyone. Like, men are denied that, like, sensual, emotional, heavy pleasure of taking care of people. And, like, most men I know in my life would, like, I think could benefit from some deep, heavy pleasure experiences.
Totally, yeah.
And so I think that's, like, you know, I think it's kind of just, it's like a full human experience, you know?
Yeah,
not to say that men are walking around not having a full... Actually, you know, like, but I think I don't know, I think it's like, it's a richer life to care for someone.
Yeah.
Whether that's your child or not, to care and to feel that, to find yourself, that capacity in yourself.
Yeah.
Is really, so yeah, I think we should talk about it, and more men should be doing it.
Yeah.
You should get Christian out here giving a lecture.
Totally. Workshops. Yeah. Parenthood lectures. Is there anything else you want to add? I think we can open it up to the floor. Otherwise,
I feel like I've been talking a lot. Thank you for
your
questions and your thoughts.
No, there's so much. I feel a little bit high. So I'm measuring my questions and thoughts, because I just gave you a bunch of weird visual metaphors and
I like it.
Controversial.
I mean, I just
theories.
brought back the heavy.
Yeah, the heavy hula.
Yeah.
I think any questions from the audience? I know it usually takes a second. Yes. Oh, and then we're going to bring you a mic so that the people on the broadcast can hear you. Over here.
Okay, hi.
Hello.
Just wanted to say thank you for your time and for speaking. I am also a Filipino American, and I resonated a lot with what you were saying, especially the idea of kind of like our families stepping in, or members who are not our families and stepping in. And I was always raised under the impression that child rearing, caretaking is kind of a concept where it takes a village, and that my Lola lived with us, and Lola, my grandmother, lived with us and took care of my family. And now seeing my sister having children, there's an assumption that my mom will one day also do that, or even my Lola, so my niece's great Lola taking care of us. And seeing how this kind of idea of family is intergenerational, and the community still prevails and exists. But I am grappling with the idea that the dependency on our parents or our friends or whoever takes who shares the role with us can be unfair. And seeing this expectation that maybe my Lola or my mom will one day have to step in is something I've been thinking about a lot, because I was raised with the idea of like, we're all hands on deck,
Right.
but also it's time to rest.
Yeah.
So hearing you talk about your parents kind of helping as well, how do you grapple with that? And like, what is your envisionment for your parents in the caretaking role when you have also seen that they've done a lot for you already?
Yeah.
So.
No, that's such a great question, and it's such a thing that I think it's just I've kind of come to a peace, and I think that, I don't know how it will be for you, but I think that part of like my whole experience, part of my like diasporic feels is just like, there's just questions that I'm gonna be wrestling with my entire life, right? But yeah, that urge to be like, no, I don't want you to feel like you have to do this thing. I want you to rest. I want you to like pick up a hobby, right? You know, like I want you to experience leisure in this way that you never have. I struggle with that. I mean, I think part of the thing is realizing though, like, I could try to insist on that, but I know that for my parents, it's like, it gives them such pure joy to take care of them. I think it's the kind of, the balance for me is like, where is it a way that it benefits all of us? You know, like, and there's scenarios where it's like, I don't want to be taking advantage of it. You know what I mean? So I always am asking myself that question, and always being like, I'm not expecting you, or it's guaranteed that you're going to do this thing. Like, we have boundaries about like asking very specifically, you know, planning ahead. So it's never like, you know, that's kind of like how I see it, and try to give, you know, obviously give them as much agency. It's hard because for generations of women, like generation, like my mother, her whole thing is like, and this is a very Filipino thing, which is like the very definition of love is sacrifice. And I don't know, like, it's very condescending for me to be like, you've gone about love and life all wrong. And thank you, by the way, because I've benefited from that, you know? It's a very, like, it's a weird negotiation. I think part of it is just like having a dialogue, an ongoing dialogue to the extent that that is possible, you know? And knowing like intergenerational, we know that in cultures where generations interact, they thrive. And so again, it's like, it's not just a thing where I'm demanding care from someone. It is, what are these children bringing to this person's life? What is this elder bringing to my life? What am I bringing to their life? And just asking ourselves those questions, I think. Yeah. Yeah, thank you for asking that.
I want to add just an anecdote.
Yeah.
That conversation you're talking about, my sister and I were just remarking how astonishing it is that we can even have conversations with our parents, because as a child, it seems unfathomable.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
Right? Like asking them, how do you feel about this? Or what's your opinion? It's wild. It's so wild.
I think, you know, it's really, I used to have this, like, I interviewed my mom a lot for this book, and that was like an interesting experience. But I realized like I was the one, and I think, you know, like you get in the way when you're younger because I would ask my parents questions, but really I was like, kind of trying to hear it, but I was more like, understand me.
Yeah,
like,
right.
How this has affected me. And I'm asking questions like for myself. And now I feel like there's this like, when I talk to my mom or my parents now, I feel like I'm better able to just be like, I just listen, you know, and like, I don't need to be right. I don't need for them to understand what I'm thinking. I just need to listen, and that makes them feel close to me.
Right.
Even though there's no like, I may not feel close to them after the conversation, right? Or like, it's just a different, it's just a different way of communicating. Like,
Yeah, totally. It's like I want to tell my parents, like, I'm finally listening to you. Any other questions or thoughts? Yeah.
Hi, thank you guys. Oh, thank you guys. I just thank you for talking about sensual, ecstatic mothering. I find that I'm still in the process of like fully embracing, like fully being able to be like rageful about all of the things that you're speaking about, but also be just as open about how sensual, ecstatic, like beautiful that experience is. Also, I was just really moved by your, like when you were talking about going back to the Philippines and speaking to your family's caretakers, and that just as growing up, going back to India, having that same experience. And I'm wondering if you, like, thinking about their experiences, having felt that same ecstatic joy in their work, like, did you have conversations like that with caretakers around, like, what they instinctively may know and be able to share with us even, you know, I don't know.
Yeah, I wish. I think, you know, if I get to go back to the Philippines, I'd like to try to have those conversations. There is for me like the deeply embarrassing and shameful language barrier that I can't speak the language, you know. Yeah, it's hard because I don't want to make any assumptions, you know, but there's also like, and so there's things that I kind of assume that I feel like I know as bodily knowledge that I cannot, like, I can't responsibly put it on paper, right? I can't put it in the book because I cannot speak for them, you know, but I also believe certain things, you know, that there is, like, I've seen at least moments of real pleasure and, you know, wisdom and expertise and all of that. Yeah, I mean, I would love nothing more than to do like a whole project of like interviewing them and talking to them about, they probably know so much more about my family, you know, in some ways that I do, you know? But yeah, like, I think it's really important, like, that relationship again is like, it's complicated, you know, like I feel, how do I like go into this, how would I approach a conversation with like Autocelia when it's like, there's that there is like a clear power differential, and then is it condescending and weird for me to be like, but I feel like I am below you. Like, I feel like I don't, but then does that make it like, teach me, you know what I mean? Like, there's a weird, it's just like another one of those negotiations that I think I'm always like, I'm getting more comfortable with like living in a question than I am in like an answer, but I'm not sure if that's a great answer to your question, but.
I love that, living in a question.
I don't really have like a question, but just like feedback. I think you guys are both really good conversationalists.
Hey, thanks.
Like, you know, and hearing you guys bounce back and forth is really, really amazing. I also really loved hearing you like just read your own writing. I just think a lot of your like feelings really came through. And it just made me think a lot about things I usually wouldn't. I mean, I don't have like I don't have any experience actually like caring for anyone, so it just makes me think of my own family, like my own mother. Yeah, that's all I have.
Well, thank you. I'm really glad that it makes you think of those things. I think I feel like that's stuff that I came really late to in life, but I'm so glad that I did, and to be able to have that chance to reflect. And I also want to say thank you to Anne, because I feel like when we do events, sometimes it's like there's all these set questions, but I really like a conversation where I actually feel like we are in conversation.
Yeah, exactly. The real, not the hypothetical. Yeah. By the way, you have a very pleasant voice.
Thank you.
I think you should do voiceover work. Like add to your day with another thing to do, right?
I mean, I would totally do it. I feel like it might pay
Doesn't
well.
she have a
you know?
dope voice? Yeah, I just keep listening to it being like, I want to hear it recorded onto something. I don't know. I don't know what. I'm going to make you read something. Other feedbacks? Questions? Look at me, I'm in lounge mode.
Yeah.
Trivia thing to also bring it back.
Great.
I was thinking about Mother's Day, and just to throw it out, Mother's Day was founded in Philadelphia.
Whoa, there you go.
Mother's Day was founded in Philadelphia?
Yeah. It's coming full circle.
How many of us are from Philadelphia? I know we have visitors. Okay, so like a couple of us. Isn't it a peculiarity of this city, I think, that there's so many things the city is proud of being the first at? It's like the first capital, the first ABC thing, you know, whatever. It's so funny. Like things start here, but it's all part of, you know, it's problematic, right? Because it's still the, what's the word? The institutional constitutional firsts, not actual firsts. But that's interesting. That's one that I think is really funny and like sweet, you know. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, especially since she then was radicalized and was like, forget this holiday that I made.
Yeah. Anti-Mother's Day. I like that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for being here.
Copies of the book are for sale at the front, and you'll sign some things and talk.
Sure,
keep
if
talking
people want me
and
to, yeah.
whatever. Yeah, cool,
Yeah.
awesome. Bye, YouTube. Bye. Oh, yeah.